Good evening and welcome to Black Lives Matter Everywhere 1 year on. I am Joe Hyman, Communities and Special Events Programmer here at JW3. If you're just connecting with us, we are the Jewish community in London, Jewish Community Centre in London that's open to all. And we're coming together 1 year on from our first Black Lives Matter Everywhere event and the tragic murder of George Floyd, to continue the conversation about racism in our community and ask the questions, what have we done in the past year? What still needs to be done? And most importantly, how can we be part of that change? Over this past year, we've seen the volume of conversation around anti-racism increase, and work that's been needed for a long time has begun in the Jewish community. The most notable achievement being the Commission on Racial Inclusivity in the Jewish community, led by our panelist Stephen Bush and the Board of Deputies. And yet, just this week, we've had our social media filled with racist comments and backlash for focusing on Black Lives Matter. I want to say that Black lives are a Jewish issue, not just because our community is home to Jews of all colours and backgrounds. We at JW3 are guided by 6 core Jewish values. 2 of those are loving kindness and inclusivity, and they are core to what we do as a Jewish community. My friend and teacher, Rabbi Deborah Blausten, recently shared a quote from the Talmud, which speaks about the possibility of holding 2 sometimes different feelings at once. She shares that the sages teach that we should make ourselves a heart of many rooms. This quote reminds us of our vast capacity for love and complexity for many issues. Tonight, I invite you to open a room in your heart, to listen to the voices of our esteemed panelists and their thoughts. And in doing so, I hope rooms and spaces upon spaces open within our community to make more room for Black Jews, Jews of colour, and Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews. I'd like to introduce our chair for this evening, Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, who will lead the conversation and introduce our esteemed panel.
Hello, so yes, I'm the chair. I'm Nadine Batchelor-Hunt. I'm a political commentator and broadcaster. I'm really happy to be here this evening and to be chairing this event. We did one like this last year, and I think it really connected with a lot of people, so it's good to be doing it again. And so, as Joe said, we're going to be looking at and discussing a year on from George Floyd, where the community is, have things changed? If so, what? Or what needs to happen next? So our panelists will be Lord Simon Wooley, founder and director of Operation Black Vote, Stephen Bush, political editor at The New Statesman and leader of the Board of Deputies Commission on Racial Inclusivity, and Dr. Edie Friedman, the founder and director of JCOR. So a really exciting panel of people, and I'm very privileged to be the chair. It's the first time I've ever chaired anything, so thank you very much. Okay, and so if we just kind of jump straight into the first question. If we start with you, Simon, what has happened a year on since, the BLM protest we had last summer? What do you think's happened since then? Do you think things have changed?
Well, thank you, Nadine. And it is an honor to be here again, having the conversation with the Jewish community and wider, broader society. As we all know, it's been a tumultuous year. I often refer to it as a double pandemic. Not just the death of George Floyd, the 9 minutes and 29 seconds that shook the world, really, but also COVID-19 and its impact that it's had on Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. I think in essence, when we look at George Floyd in life, his life was devalued. He was expendable by those who were supposed to protect him. But in death, he became a symbol for justice, a symbol for equality, and a symbol for a desire for a better world. And that's why we saw the greatest protest here on race inequality ever, in terms of the length and the breadth. And the fact that it wasn't just Black youths that took to the streets, it was white youths and Black and white elderly, if I may say, like Edie and I, who also demanded this be from this tragedy, this brutal murder that demonstrated, Nadine, that it wasn't just the knee that killed George Floyd, it was the system that gave a tacit green light for lethal force on the most innocuous interaction. Wasn't the first, it wasn't the last. What did we see? Well, apart from the protest, I think one of the most fantastic things we did see was the opening up of conversations, particularly around big business, but also around government and around society. And many of these conversations were difficult because I think for the first time in my lifetime, Edie, that Black and brown people were listened to as never before. And I was on many calls with CEOs who'd listened to their staff and they wept, not least because they heard stories of lived experiences of subtle and not so subtle inequality that broke their hearts because they thought they were decent human beings, and yet on their watch, inequality after inequality was laid bare. In those conversations, many CEOs said, we must change. They looked around, they looked at their boards, they looked at their senior management, and it was spot the Black and brown person. Their staff told them that they would train white people, and those white people would go past them for promotion while they stayed the same. So I think in some quarters, the most profound conversation in British society begun. The sad part, and I want to also hear from our other guests, the sad part is that our government, who was forced to respond to the Black Lives Matter, set up a commission that was rigged, that was deceitful and dishonest, and set out to close down this most wonderful discussion. And when they concluded their report, the Sewell report, some call it the sewage report, that they started with a conclusion that they held 3 to 10 years ago, that systemic racism doesn't exist and we should be thankful because we've never had it so good. At a time when our nation should be having the greatest conversation in its history, they closed down the debate, denied lived experiences, and even had a story, even sought to rewrite the slavery story, the enslavement of Africans, in a way that we should be happy about. I mean, I'm guessing they were thinking that I should be pleased that my name's Simon Wooley, a British name, and not an African name, which was erased along with my culture. So there's a parallel universe going on at the moment. One is government, full square against the greatest conversation Britain has ever had. And the other universe, which you are having, which academic institutions are having, which businesses are having, and which is saying, we're not just going to build back better, because back wasn't great. Back was unequal. These protests, this disease has laid bare structural inequalities, and we need to build new, better. And when we do, everybody wins. We unleash talent. We unleash a sense of oneness, a sense of understanding our histories, understanding that we can learn from the past, not deny it. Let's see where we go. Right now, I'm also sensing a bit of weariness about Black Lives Matter in the Jewish community, in the white community. Today, I'm speaking to your audience. I'm looking for allies. I'm looking for brothers and sisters, white and black, to use this opportunity for the greatest discussion that will transform our society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. That's all really, really important points. And I think if we stay on this topic, just, I'm going to ask Stephen and also Edie, if we start with Stephen, what do you think has happened a year on from the original BLM protest? What's your perspective on it? Do you think there's been progress made? Or do you think that it's become wearisome for some people? Like Simon said, what's your assessment a year on?
Well, I think I suppose, obviously, I start from the view that we've had quite a bit of progress in that we've had this first of its kind, as far as we know, in the diaspora, and the first of its kind in the United Kingdom of a ethnic minority community turning inwards and looking at racism within its own walls, which I think has been a hugely positive sort of first step. I think on the point of fatigue, I think it's certainly true to say that one of the difficulties, right, is it's great to have a sort of conversation to break new ground, but understandably people become very rapidly disillusioned if they feel that nothing actually ever changes and nothing really happens, right? So to take, because I'm a football fan, so I'm going to start with football as my kind of my starting point. To take the taking of the knee at football games, right, which does not seem to have been accompanied by any meaningful action by big English football clubs to actually tackle any of the problems within their actual sphere of control, and has been accompanied by a willingness to be incredibly casual about the impact that our biggest football clubs have as global citizens. So I think there's been lots of very positive things to do. I mean, obviously, I would think that. But I am concerned that in an odd way, it becomes a bit entering almost into a zone where it becomes this thing where we recite catechisms at one another, right? Oh, we've acknowledged this, or oh, we admit this, or we look at ourselves and we accept and we have more to do, rather than things actually happening. And I think it's a shame that the government's response was a report which excluded several minorities from its understanding of race inequalities, and also then produced a series of recommendations that were all old news, with the exception of 3 of the 24. And so that is disappointing, and therefore a bit of a problem. And I think in some ways typifies the sort of problem we have of kind of people accepting it, reciting the words, but not actually doing anything. And to me, the really important thing about the next year is that we move towards actually doing things rather than just calling for things and talking about things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Edie, what about you? Where do you think we are a year on? Do you agree with a lot of what Stephen and Simon have said?
Well, absolutely. And I think it's important to look at this word solidarity that we hope to show other communities, and how we actually understand that in terms of, as Simon was talking about, the lived experience of different communities. And one of the aims of JCOR was to help all of us to actually understand, well, what are we talking about when we talk about racism? So we're talking about child poverty rates, which are twice for Black children, twice as high as they are for white children, twice as likely to be unemployed if you're Black. 23% of Black and Asian communities live in overcrowded accommodation compared to 3% of white communities. And one of the most shocking statistic is about Black maternal deaths being 4 times as high as white maternal deaths. So we're talking about not only bad police officers or bad attitudes that some people have, and those sort of people who have responded on social media to this event that Joe was talking about, but we're talking about very concrete lived experiences. And so from our point of view, we wanted to do things that would help people understand, well, what is racism? And we've done things like produce a resource, 10 things you can do to combat racism. We've been talking to schools and other institutions to look at what they do, obviously within the curriculum. And of course, Stephen's inquiry had some very positive things to say about that. We've produced resource sheets for schools so that pupils would have the opportunity to look at issues such as, who was Stephen Lawrence? What is the Windrush scandal all about? What is the debate around statues? And we've done a number of mini lectures looking at issues such as the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black and Asian communities, as well as the history of Jewish anti-racism in the United States, South Africa, and in Britain, because it's important that we're in touch with our own history and our own experience. So that's the practical side, but there's also the campaigning side, to join with others and to say that Britain must have a permanent memorial to the victims of the transatlantic slave trade, to say that the victims of Windrush deserve justice and they deserve it now. And asylum seekers and refugees, which we would see under this whole umbrella of anti-racism, also deserve justice. And that we need to actually do something very practical about rates of child poverty, which disproportionately affect Black children. And adding to what Simon has said, and Stephen, about the Sewell report, very much wanting to support the Runnymede Trust's response to the report, that A, ditch it, and B, why don't we implement many of the recommendations that have been made by so many previous inquiries. So there's a lot that we know that needs to be done. And this was the year that we should actually go back to the drawing board, not have a new inquiry, but actually start to implement many of the recommendations that we know have to be implemented if we're going to achieve racial equality in this country.
Yeah, and I think what you said as well about the curriculum, when it comes to BLM reevaluating that sort of stuff, just thinking when it comes to the culture wars that we've seen pushed in the press, what's your view on that, Simon? Do you feel that in a way, on one hand, we've had progress in the way we talk about slavery and colonialism, but on the other hand, it's kind of been co-opted into this culture war? Do you feel like sometimes that's kind of drowning out the important issues at points?
Well, there's a tension going on. First and foremost, never before in British history have we had conversations about the enslavement of Africans and about those involved in the transatlantic slavery. For centuries, we've held slave owners on pedestals, named schools and halls after them. These are people that with their hands are drenched in blood. And the way that they laundered their money and cleaned their blood was to use the money to put into universities and schools and buildings. And so they laundered themselves and then put them on pedestals. And then when professors and academics and students said, actually, these people were wretched human beings, they did shocking things in the name of greed. And let's have a conversation. Rather than have a conversation, and I keep coming back to this because I think it's so profound that this historic conversation that we could have, primarily about how the past and the institutions that we built in law, in academia, in business, in shipping, how all of this infrastructure was built in slavery and colonialism and still affects today. The way we see the world, the way we interact with the world, the way we do business with the world. We think about today that Africa is the richest continent on the planet, and yet simultaneously the poorest. The G7 are meeting tomorrow, and one of their discussions will be why are countries like Haiti and many African countries paying 20, 30, 40% of their national income to debt, servicing the debt from the World Bank. How is it when we had 80 million coronavirus jabs from the big companies in the modern world, that the World Health Organization said 25 went to the poorest countries? The past is still affecting the present. And the biggest question we should have is that this historic double pandemic has given us the opportunity to be honest, to zoom out, to have the greatest conversation. Imagine for a second that we had a conversation about our education, about our institutions, and then from that we learn from it and we reset to be more honest, to understand how one affects the other. How much richer would our children be? I think you're on mute, Nadine.
Sorry. On the point of education, I was just thinking, Stephen, your report that you did on racism in the Jewish community had recommendations which kind of went into a bit on educating Jewish young people at schools. What roles? So first of all, if for people that are watching that may not know much about the report that you did, could you kind of run down a little bit on what the key findings were, and also what roles do you think educating Jewish young people and the Jewish community more broadly plays in this kind of strides towards racial equality and equity?
Right. So the report, for people who weren't familiar with it, we started with a call for evidence of both written and oral testimony from minorities within the minority, be they British Asian Jews, Jews from the various diasporas currently resident here who but not British citizens, or mixed race, adopted, people who converted, the sort of whole scope of diversity within our community. And from that, I produced a series of recommendations. Now, actually, the ones on education, bluntly, I don't see that as about an issue of needing to educate the Jewish community or Jewish young people, right? There are recommendations that children should be taught about the history of the empire in the Sewell report, in the Macpherson report, in essentially every single report on race and racism in the United Kingdom starts from the perspective that, finds, despite the varied politics of the people tasked to doing these rules, says, actually, look, this is a thing that you need to get into. And I think the reason why that is so important is we can never understand ourselves if we do not understand where we have come from. And that holds as much true for self-knowledge as it does for knowledge of us as a nation, right? The history of the United Kingdom, as our own history as a community demonstrates, is one of, of successful multiculturalism and multiracial democracy, but one in which minorities have continually faced sometimes similar, sometimes different, but always similar challenges, and how they have played out to create the society we have today and to create some of the benefits we enjoy relative to other people around the world today. And I think historical knowledge is just so important. And that's why it's core to some of our recommendations, because if you do not know, for example, that there are British Jews who did not, like my great-great-great-grandparents, come here in the 19th century, but came here from Iran, from Iraq in this century. If you do not know, then there are people who came here from Ethiopia in the last 30 years. You don't know your own history, and it's important to know your own history in order to understand the present.
Yeah, 100%. And what if you could just summarize what the key recommendations were from that report again? Because if people may be watching that may not have read the whole thing. So if you've got like kind of maybe the top 5 or something that the kind of things that really struck you about the feedback you got and what you felt was our kind of recommendations that came out of that.
Well, I mean, of the 119 report recommendations, I obviously, it's a bit like asking me to pick a favorite child, but I think that the central recommendations are, one, that sort of broad set of historical and young people race recognition. 2, just a broader sense of awareness that there is no such thing as looking Jewish, and then an important set of recommendations about how we balance the challenge of security and the terrorist threat that we sadly face as a community in this country, and how we balance that with being welcoming spaces, including citing JW3's high security, high equity model as one that's worth following. So those are kind of 3 of the recommendations, but I would just strongly urge people to read it all and pick their own favorite.
And Edie, what was your assessment of Stephen's report? Did you feel like it hit a lot of nails on the head that you'd noticed when you've been working in the community on issues surrounding racism?
Well, I think the the recommendations, particularly in terms of schools and young people, terribly important and needed to be reinforced. I think a lot of schools actually appreciate that this needed to be done. I don't know if that was translated into actually putting it into action, but it's really important for a community to look at itself, and it's that balance between looking at itself and looking outwards. And one would hope that looking at ourselves and looking at the diversity within the Jewish world would help us to appreciate and be happier to interact with the diversity outside of the Jewish world. And we sometimes, I've heard it said numerous times, I'm Jewish, I can't be prejudiced. Well, we know that that is not true, and that being a member of minority group it's not a vaccination to having views about other people. And what it can do is in a sense the very opposite of, it can mean that you compete with other minority groups in the sort of victim state, which is very damaging and doesn't either help your own community or other communities. And I think anything that helps the Jewish community to be more at ease and recognize its responsibilities to build a strong, ethical, fair, multi-faceted society is something that we always have to engage with, and to know that it has its challenges, but nevertheless challenges should not mean that we shy away. And as been said many times, if you're not a part of the solution, you're part of the problem. That by doing nothing we are perpetuating the inequality that exists in this country, and indeed probably most countries in the world. And I'd like to go back. I mean, I know Simon has spoken about the need in COVID has given us an opportunity to have another 1945 moment when we, post-war, we created the health service, the welfare state, and how important it is to go back and do something big and bold, because certainly COVID has taught us, if we didn't know already, about levels of inequality in this society. And inequality is bad for everyone, including those who aren't victims of it. And how important that, and this has been also echoed by medical organizations, legal organizations as well, how we really have to do something big and bold now in order to create that sort of society that people were aiming to create from the ashes of the Second World War. We have this opportunity, and let us really actually rise to the challenge of it.
And Simon, so I was just wondering, as somebody who isn't in the Jewish community, you've obviously seen Stephen's report. What was your kind of assessment of the report? Do you think, as as an outsider looking into the community, do you think you've seen progress? Because obviously we were in this position a year ago talking about what the future held. We're a year later now, and have you seen progress from within our community?
Well, I think overall the report has been brave to look in the mirror and say, people who look like me who are Jewish are not being treated fairly. And if as a community, a society, we cannot confront uncomfortable truths, then we can't deal with them. So I think for that point alone, it's not beating yourself up and saying we're awful. It's saying this is the way society is, and we're part of wider society, and we have to be honest about what we are doing too. I think the report sought to speak to that. I'm a political activist in the Dr. Martin Luther King mode. I wanted them to be bolder and braver. I wanted them to say that the Sewell report is retrograde. The Sewell report sends us back, because we needed that type of solidarity, because we've seen we have elements of the government that are foursquare in denial that would take us back, Nadine, to the 1950s. And instead of embracing the discussion, they're saying, as you suggested, that it's a culture war. Because we want to look at a real history, they say we people like me want to cancel culture. Nothing could be further from the truth. But our children need to know the full story, 360, not just a portion of it that is flag waving and too often, Nadine, jingoistic. But I'm afraid that too many people have retreated into their trenches and arguing, defending the indefensible. And I don't know. I just hope that there are many on this call that will show, Nadine, like Edie has with me for 30 years, the allyship. And in that allyship, Edie, a white woman, a Jewish woman, has said to anyone that will listen that my struggle is her struggle. And I say to Edie, your struggle is my struggle. We support each other. We're stronger together. Doesn't mean that we always agree. I've been around breakfast tables with Edie and great late June Jacobs and Yasmin Ali Brown, and we fiercely argued. And afterwards we hug each other and say, see you next week. And this is adult conversations. That's why when Edie and JW3 say to me, Simon, can you join us for a conversation? And I said, I've had so many conversations. I can't lie, I'm a little bit tired. But I can't say no to Edie. I can't say no to JW3. Why? Because we stand shoulder to shoulder, wanting a better world. It's the first time I've been with Stephen. I hope to work with you more. I'm going to push you, Stephen. Sometimes I think that you need to be stronger, braver. This is the time. Let me say this, Nadine. What I've seen in this past year is this, that in this tumultuous times, I guess in any tumultuous times, that leaders emerge. And I'm encouraging leaders to come out of the shadows. Leaders who don't think they're leaders, who are ready to confront the monster of racism, of anti-Semitism. And I think the younger, great, we need that young generation to come forward. And so that's why you Nadine, they're young leaders, right? I've got my eye out. But we nurture young leaders to come through, have a voice. This is that time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so when it comes to speaking out on racism, as I'm sure everyone here, you inevitably receive racism in response when you're trying to speak out against these kinds of injustices. I mean, I think Joe, when he started this call, he said there'd been racist comments on Facebook right ahead of this event when it was being advertised, and we've had already, I can see we've had some like a pretty racist comment in the comments in response to this chat. Stephen, did you experience backlash? What was the response to your report more broadly? Did you experience, were you quite warmly received with what your findings were? Did you experience backlash? Because I think it's really important to have these honest conversations about how things are being received within the community, rather than kind of, not getting down into it's not a nice conversation to have, but how was it received? Did you experience anything racist in response?
Yeah, so I'll first say the overwhelming majority of responses to the report were very positive, and we and I'm very pleased that we achieved a level of cross-denominational support that then certainly no other organisation to have conducted something like this has managed that level. There were, of course, inevitably, as you say, whenever you speak about these issues, there is always a fringe of people who say things that are motivated by prejudice. I suppose, to be honest, my attitude to that kind of stuff is mostly just to ignore it, because I kind of think that one of the The real problem I feel we have as a society at the moment, and this is sort of cheered on and amplified by the broadcasters in particular, is we're becoming a society of or propositions, right? You support X or you support Y. Whereas the only way then we can live together sustainably in a diverse society is if we're an and society. If we seek to say, well, we agree that we have shared interests on X and Y, and we try to respect each other's differences and disagreements. The things I actually found painful, to be honest, was the stuff which was more born out of ignorance or the response to it where the person who clearly hadn't read it, right? They complained about the use of an invented term that exists nowhere in the report, exists nowhere in any report on this issue ever written, and talked about the report's methods in ways that just were completely alien to it. That kind of felt more exhausting. It's just like, why do I have to, deal with this kind of thing? But I think the sad thing is the one positive about the last half decade is I have grown so inured to when I write about racism to it being met by racism that I simply no longer notice it. It's one of those things where I just feel like, I've now had so many experiences of being told, oh, the only reason why I care about Labour anti-Semitism is because I hate the Palestinians, or the only reason why I care isn't I just, don't want to nationalise the railways or whatever. And I've had so many conversations about, the only reason why you write this on Stop and Search is because you think that criminals should be able to go about their business. Then I think by the point that I had launched this report, I had just developed a kind of rhino hide almost. And I just really didn't notice a lot of it. And also the fact that the overwhelming majority was so positive kind of meant it was even easier to not be affected by the negative stuff.
Mm-hmm. And Edie, what has it been like? Because obviously you've been doing a lot of anti-racist activism within the Jewish community for a long time. How have you felt the report's been received within the spaces that you operate?
Well, I think by and large, there's been a very positive response. I think what worries me, if we look back the past year, that there were a lot of conversations about all of these issues. And I think the challenge for all of us is how to maintain these conversations, how to make them as relevant today, over 1 year since the killing of George Floyd, because the issues are the same as they were a year ago. Those levels of inequality, the actual existence and the persistence of racial inequality in Britain is the same now. In some ways, perhaps have become more entrenched because COVID has exposed how, particularly in health, how Black communities are further disadvantaged. So the challenge, we need to, without additional reports, we need to be fighting these sort of fights all the time. And it's difficult because it's a very crowded space, isn't it, in terms of the social issues that we all have to deal with. And we know that the news cycle, goes by really quickly. And so how do we, in the absence of, another murder of someone like George Floyd, how do we maintain that interest so that we're turning our solidarity into something that's meaningful and that ultimately will result in some sort of change? Because unless we do that, then we're sort of on a treadmill, and I'd like to get off and see some very positive change, and how that is a conversation we need to have or demand from the government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so talking more broadly, I think one of the things that you may have touched on earlier, Simon, is this race report. Obviously, I think most people within the government call it the industry of anti-racism, whatever that means. Most people that work within the sphere of anti-racism have seen this report as a bit shocking. Do you think, I personally perhaps think there could, leadership within the Jewish community could maybe come together a bit more and come out and condemn that? Is that something that, Simon, you've thought as an outsider looking in? Because I think when it was all happening with the race report, I I perhaps would have liked a bit more solidarity and a bit more kind of condemnation of the report from leadership. What was your view on that?
Yeah, I wanted to see greater allyship, greater solidarity in this, because, look, this wasn't a few voices saying that this report was disingenuous and politicized and etc., etc. This was the British Medical Association with 150,000 doctors. 400 academics wrote and said, this doesn't represent history and our interaction with the individuals. And I just thought to myself, it would have been low-hanging fruit for Jewish organizations to say we stand in solidarity with the overwhelming majority of Black and brown people that says this report is a lost opportunity, because that's what it was, a fantastic opportunity. And I agree with almost everything that Edie says, but I disagree with her on one point. Last year was the year of talking. I want this year for it to be the year of acting. I want us to pivot from saying we know something's wrong to now this is what we're going to do. I'm actually still supportive of the footballers, Stephen, in a very big way. I think it's still symbolic and tells the footballing world we've got to do better. It's not the footballers' fault that the football bosses react slowly, and then you blame the footballers for taking the knee. I think if we're not careful, people will politicize taking the knee and saying we've had enough of this, and we've had enough of, I saw in the chat someone saying that Black Lives Matter is an anti-Semitic organization. Black Lives Matter is a movement, a broad movement of individuals demanding that we acknowledge and confront race inequality. There might be strands of Black Lives Matter that have become highly politicized, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're big enough to see the wheat from the chaff. We're smart enough not to lean into those detractors out there that would just love to close this debate. They could close the debate. They might win and close the debate. It doesn't get society closer to each other, more comfortable with our kaleidoscope of differences, that we tackle the systemic inequalities that have been laid bare. They might win, but we all lose. What we have to do as activists, you know what I like about this this past year, Nadine? That it reminds me of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. You know, one thing that struck me about that movement that changed the world was the solidarity between Black and white youths, the freedom riders, young Jewish students and Black students, no older than 25, got on buses, traveled around the country and were firebombed. And they went around the country in solidarity to say, our world must change. That was the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The young men and women that took to the streets were the 21st century civil rights activists. Black, brown, and white, Jewish, Hindu, Muslim. They said to us, the elders, we demand better. We deserve better. And if you listen to us, if you listen to our pleas for change, great things could happen. I mean, I was watching them and I was just thinking, oh my gosh, this is the civil rights movement all over again, driven by young people that we should celebrate. Not to say that they were, what did the Saul report call them? In a dream world where their views didn't match reality. Stop insulting these hundreds of thousands of people. Stop it. This is a time when some of us elders have to say, look, I'm following these young people because they've got it spot on.
And just thinking, you know, about racism Black people face, and obviously recently there's been an uptick of anti-Semitism because of it tends to happen when something happens in the Middle East, in like what's been happening over the last few weeks and months. There's an uptick. Perhaps this is also one for Stephen, because I think you said earlier about security at synagogues and how the JDW3 model is something that you looked at. How do we reconcile the fact that a lot of people call for extra policing at times of anti-Semitism, but then if you're a Jewish person of colour, police aren't necessarily like an force that make you feel safe. They've got racism problems themselves. So how do you think we kind of work through that? I mean, anyone can kind of chip in as well, but if we start with Stephen, like, what do you think the kind of solution is there? It's like knocking heads on the issue.
Well, look, I have to be candid here. I actually kind of would reject that characterization, right? If you look at what polls consistently show us, actually, is that, and as you know, a wet liberal, I don't, to be honest, understand this perspective, but then actually every community in the United Kingdom broadly thinks that more police fixes the issue of safety and crime, right? Yeah, my tenants association here in this estate, every single time, the two things everyone wants more of are more CCTV and more police on the beat. Now, there are, of course, then people have serious objections to the quality of the policing they receive. So actually, I think this is an issue where there's a lot more consensus than both exists, but is also sort of available to kind of be campaigned on and campaigned around, which is that broadly what essentially everyone in the United Kingdom wants is better policing, right? The average person thinks, and the average police officer does a pretty bad job of catching crimes, catching criminals. We can argue about whether that's about austerity or whether that's about prejudice in the police, meaning that they kind of look for a type rather than looking for evidence, whether it's a combination of both. But I think actually, in terms of the challenge of, all right, okay, how do we deal with the security threat we face? We need police. That isn't an issue of division outside of sort of elite opinion. I also think the thing I would say is that the reason why the CST exists and the reason why its expertise is so useful is that we have seen as a community that the police have not necessarily been the most effective outlet in tackling anti-Semitism and violent anti-Semitism and understanding the nature of the threat we face in a serious way. Now, we should be very grateful. One of the things the CST does very well is work with the police to improve that. But when we talk about the need to reform the police in a United Kingdom context, right, and this is why knowing our history is so important for the rest of the United Kingdom, is that we have modelled the need to make the necessary changes so you actually have an effective police force that doesn't do things that you don't want them to be doing. So I think actually this is why I talk about the need to find and propositions rather than all propositions, because I do think that on the issue of security, it is something which you can turn into an and proposition rather than an or proposition.
What do you think, Simon? What's your view on it? Can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
Sure. Look, we all know the police have a long way to go in regards to the way that they interact with Black people. You're 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched. That too often an innocuous interaction, you're a whisker away from violence. I remember the Bianca Williams and Ricardo dos Santos. Now imagine this for a second, and this chimed with something that's in the chat that says, why don't we label the movement different, like all human lives matter? Well, I mean, this is the whole thing about Black Lives Matter, because Black people have noticed that Black lives matter less. And so if Black lives matter less, we're saying, can we matter? Can we matter? Because our experience is that we matter less. Let me give you 2 concrete examples. Bianca Williams and Ricardo dos Santos were a middle-class Black couple driving a nice car in London. In the back of the car, they had a 3-month-old child. 3-month-old child. The police pulled them up, dragged them out the car. They were a whisker away from being beaten with a truncheon, a whisker away. Dragged away from their screaming child. Be honest with yourself when you look at this screen. Do you think that that could happen to a white middle-class couple with a 3-month-old child in the back? Question 1. Question 2. When you see a black man on the floor with a police officer on their neck, and the man is saying, "I can't breathe," and in his last dying breath, he calls out for his deceased mother. The police officer knows he's being filmed, but he has the impunity of the way law enforcement protects white officers. Second question, could you see a white man in that situation?
Yeah.
If the answer is no, Black lives matter less. And that's why the movement emerged to say to the world, please can we change this? I said to you at the beginning of this conversation that George Floyd was dispendable. His life didn't matter. So we as Black people say, when can we be valued? When can our children be afforded a quality opportunity? Why do our mothers have to die at such a greater rate than white mothers? Why can't we be given the vaccine? Why can't our countries flourish? Why at every time that we lay bare these shocking facts, that people keep saying to me, why can't we change it if all lives matter? When is that going to stop? And if I say to you, as white Jewish people, can you believe me? Can you believe me? And then we can do things together. But if you're always challenging me to saying, some people say, you got a chip on your shoulder. Why are you always complaining? How do we change things? You know, it's 9 o'clock at night. I'm tired. I'm tired of having to keep justifying why we're confronting race inequality. What I want to do, I have a wonderful position in October in heading a Cambridge college. I want to just focus my time on nurturing talent, Black and white, but I've got to do both. I've still got to tear down the pillars of systemic racism, and I need help. Can't be done by a few of us. I'm tired.
I recently spoke to David Lamy, I think it was it 2 weeks ago now, and he was saying similar stuff, saying, you know, I'm just tired of having to have the same conversations and things just need to change. Before we go on to Q&A from the audience, Edie, do you have anything you want to add to what we were just talking about when it came to?
Well, I mean, we know within the wider Jewish community that there are times when we wanted our issues discussed just in terms of anti-Semitism and being Jewish. And I think we have to understand and appreciate that racism, whether it's Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, affects different communities differently. And the fight against anti-Semitism is not demeaned by recognizing that in terms of employment, in terms of housing, in terms of health, that what is happening to Black and Asian communities is different from what happens to white communities. And it doesn't decrease our own ism. And that many, many communities feel that they don't count. Their community doesn't count. And I know, I mean, we know that David Baddiel wrote a book about Jews don't count. Well, my response to that is absolutely, but so do other communities feel they don't count either. And we have to be in a position not to compete with each other, but to recognize that the reality of racism is that it will impact on different groups in different sort of ways. And we all have to work together in order to create that sort of society so that one group is not disadvantaged. And that is a sign of strength. not of weakness, but I think we have a long way to go, because we, and it's quite natural, want our ism to be recognized above other sorts of isms. And we have to recognize that there are times that we have to work on our own, but certainly there are times that we have to work together to combat all forms of racism, whether it's against Muslims, Jews, Roma, etc. And that is a part of our maturity. And I think we should really relish that opportunity. And I think from the Jewish community, we have to demand that the government has a race equality program policy with actual targets that is going to work towards decreasing levels of racial inequality in this country. This is what we have to ask for. It isn't just about solidarity, but it is demanding that we put procedures in place that will do something about these unacceptable levels of racial inequality in Britain. And the end result of that is that we'll all be better off.
Yeah. Okay. So then we're going to go into the Q&A. I think we're running a bit behind for the Q&A, so we'll start this now. So we've got, just, chip in, you guys chip in whenever you want. So I've got a question here from Jeremy. He says, it's just moved. He says, how do we build sustainable Black Jewish community alliances at local level? As a councillor in a mixed area, we helped arrange an impactful local rally a year ago with strong participation from both communities, but it's been hard to channel that energy into a long-term ongoing alliances and activity. And what do you guys have to say about that? Does someone want to go first, or shall I pick someone? Or
well, I'm happy to go first, and I think that we have to show that's just continuing what I said before, and picking up from what Simon was saying, is that solidarity means actually standing up and demanding change. That it just isn't enough to say that we have the solidarity, we understand the pain caused by the killing of George Floyd, but we have to be a part of asking for real change. And I know some people say, oh, that's too political. Everything is political. And unless we get that real change, we are going to be in a position of living in a society which is terribly unequal, and we will all pay the price for that. So I think alliances can become stronger and actually work when we actually work together much more systematically. But we fall short very often, and we have to find ways of actually doing it better.
Mm-hmm.
Let me say, 25 years ago that I sat with Edie, we had our little group called the Black Jewish Forum. And the Black Jewish Forum was African Asians, Caribbeans, Muslim Hindus, Jewish, Christian. And we met at June Jacobs' house in North London. And we spoke politics, and we spoke race equality, and we supported one another. Now, we all got busy, and we didn't carry on after about 15 years. Wonderful solidarity. And then we saw the anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and we said we need to reconvene. So now we belong to a new project, which is similar to what we had, called the Black, Asian and Jewish Alliance. And it's not community-based, but it's a community of activists and thinkers. So we're trying. Look, I'm a Black activist on with JCOR and You Today to support the Jewish community, to put my shoulder against anti-Semitism. But that shouldn't stop me talking about the plight of Palestinians. It shouldn't stop me from talking about the elements of brutality within the Israeli government without people shutting me down. And that the space that I have with Edie and others is that we can have these difficult conversations, very challenging, very delicate, because it's predicated on love of one another, of unity, and to ensure that those that are vulnerable, those that are little or no power, have a voice. It's not easy, but what I don't want, I've seen some of the chat here that, when you talk about Black Lives Matter, default, yeah, what about them? What about this connection? What about that connection? Always trying to look for the negative, always trying to do it down rather than engage with it in a way that moves us all forward. Stephen,
yeah. So I guess I would start with a challenge to Jeremy, which isn't part of the role of a councillor to be a sustainable community bridging organisation, right? That's why our political parties were formed. I mean, so in the context of writing the report, what are the enduring, cross-communal, in a British community sense, cross-communal lists? Well, they are around ecumenical work between churches and synagogues. Now, according to the last census, and I imagine in the next one as well, obviously the majority of Black British people are religiously observant and are observant Christians, and the majority of British Jewish people are observant to varying degrees. But of course, for those of us who simply have a synagogue, we have a huge amount of guilt about not going to. That doesn't capture all of us within its family. What it does show is the importance of building sustainable institutions. Now, one of the problems, and I think we do have to be frank about this, one of the problems with the Black Lives Matter movement is precisely that. It doesn't have a leadership, which means that we have a situation where, kind of people talk about, oh, well, Black Lives Matter said this, which they mean, oh, a Twitter account where there's this really opaque process that Twitter decides something is verified. And then people can say things which, I'm sorry, as far as I'm concerned, are just open and shut, obviously anti-Semitic statements, and they can't be disavowed, but they just clog up the debate and mean you don't ever get progress. And the thing I would say in terms of sustainable institutions is we are really blessed in the Jewish community to have leadership that has a democratic component in the Board of Deputies. And then it's very important for us to safeguard and maintain that as an institution. Because if you do not have democratic leadership, then you always get represented by the loudest, the most sort of, oh yeah, who's the BBC going to get, who's going to have a good clip and say something controversial. And that means you end up poorly represented and with, divisive and unsustainable reasons. So I think one of the things is to model what Edie and Simon have done, which is build an institution, right? An institution is a thing that makes relationships sustainable. And then that institution needs to have transparent ways that you can get rid of its leaders. Because movements where you can't get rid of your leadership for whatever reason don't work. They always collapse into failure, infighting, and in some cases bigotry.
Can I just add that I think another element is just to see Black and Jewish people working within their local neighborhood, that we have to just do things as people. And it is very often when people work together that a lot of the social stereotypes actually break down. But, we all want the same things. We all want good schools. We all want a clean environment. We want adequate policing. And if there are ways, and this is where, going back to Jeremy's point about local counselors, that they need to galvanize us to actually roll up our sleeves and work together. And I think that's really powerful, because it's that balance between being a Black person and a Jewish person, that personhood needs to be activated. And that's, I think, a really important way that we begin to break down the many stereotypes that we all have of each other. And I think they're quite profound, they're deep-seated, and we really need to work to rid them from our own minds, let alone from the wider society.
And then I think this will be, unless any more questions come up, I think this will be the last one. And this is just kind of an amalgamation of lots of different comments, I think, questions coming through, which is, as Stephen touched on, you'll have kind of people that claim to be part of BLM or whatever, and they will make anti-Semitic comments, or they will, and there's the classic, they'll claim to be criticizing Israel, but actually they are veering into anti-Semitic tropes. And how do Jewish people, if there's Jewish people watching this and they feel a bit, how do I liaise with these organizations if I feel X, Y, Z, I feel like there's anti-Semitism happening, whatever? How do we kind of make it clear that these individuals that are doing these anti-Semitic acts aren't representative of liberation for Black people? Because, a racial equality for Black people isn't mutually exclusive with Jews. So Simon, what would you say to that?
Well, we just have to be smart enough to articulate it in a way that says, I support the Black Lives Matter movement, that is to challenge systemic racism, that I don't support any of those elements that Stephen spoke about from a few crazy people, that from this broad umbrella. But the broad message, I 100% agree with. And it's the same with us, that about confronting, acknowledging anti-Semitism, because people say it doesn't exist, and etc. No, it needs to be called out, needs to be acknowledged. And I think it's important when a Black person who is non-Jewish calls it out. That is a solidarity that I expect from myself. I read Naomi Copeland, Yarrow, and she said to me, Simon, you mustn't tire. I'm tired today for the moment, but tomorrow I'll be doing cartwheels and fighting this fight, because it needs to be fought. And in some ways, Naomi, I feel privileged. People talk about white privilege. I feel privileged to be part of movements that can help change our world, that can offer pathways to success, that allow us to be more comfortable with each other. But sometimes I have to say, we should be putting our foot on the gas of building new, better, not holding the line against the sewage report that says systemic racism doesn't exist. I shouldn't be holding that line. That's when I get really tired, Naomi. And I look forward to the conversations that we will have with JCOR and JW3 in the weeks and months ahead. And my super activist friend Edie Friedman, who she doesn't tire. I mean, I don't know whether she's drinking ginseng or something. I wish she'd give me some of that superpower stuff. But I feel honoured that I can campaign with her.
Oh, that's really sweet. It's really sweet that you guys have been working together for so long. Like, it's really heartwarming. I think we've had one more question and then we'll wrap it up. And this question is more about kind of Jewish schooling. So it says, unlike a generation ago, most Jewish children now go to Jewish schools, which are much less ethnically diverse than wider British society. How can we create positive attitudes to difference from an early age with limited mixing in schools? Maybe that's a question that's maybe best directed at Stephen and Edie.
We got a lot of testimony about this from Jewish parents of all denominations and stripes, and from across our various diasporas, and from essentially every flavor of Jewish parent possible to imagine made a submission on this, because obviously in large part, sometimes for some of the reasons, and people like me who feel very guilty about having a synagogue we don't ourselves go to, but if we have children, what we want is for our children to learn about our history and traditions. And then going, oh, I would also like my children to learn about the area that they're in now, and that's one of the. And so, I think this question is a very good one, and I think it speaks to a very real hunger among most parents in our community to ensure that that's the case. I think one of the things I recommend quite specifically to meet that is twinning. for schools to do things like Outward Bound and other trips together with other schools where possible, so that they are sharing resources. Now, I'm very aware, and I hope it's very clear that schools face a huge number of diktats from the centre at the moment, which makes it very difficult for them to be flexible or innovative. But I think that kind of thing is one way of meeting that challenge, of meaning that people can have the best of both worlds.
And just to add that at JCOR, we've created education material which helps pupils to not only recognize racism, but also to look at what are their responsibilities to build a better society for all of us. And if because of anti-Semitism, because of racism, and we have to be honest that all communities have bigotry that has to be examined and worked on. But if you don't have a seat on at the table, then you are helping to perpetuate the very things that damage our society. And we have to teach children to think. We have to teach children to be able to recognize that ambiguity and complexity is a part of life, and there aren't simple answers to things. But because of the complexities of things, it doesn't mean that we don't have that responsibility to be actively engaged in making that sort of change. We have no choice. We have to be there. And by not being there, then we only perpetuate the problem, which makes our society a much more problematic one for all of us. So we should be positive about this challenge and help young people and people of all ages recognize that we have this responsibility to be able to say Black Lives Matter and not to be ashamed of it, because we have to recognize the systemic discrimination that has been going on for years, and we have an opportunity to change it, and we have to encourage, demand that government has a much more active role in turning the tide against the racism that disfigures Britain.
I agree. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our talk, BLM Everywhere, a year on. So I'm going to hand back over to Joe, I think, who will pop up now. But thank you very much, guys. It was great. It was great having you, and I felt very privileged to be able to chair that panel. So thank you.
Apologies, I was muted. I'll just repeat my closing words. Thank you for joining us this evening with JCOR. It's been over a year since BLM and combating racism was the center of the conversation around the world. And our aim tonight was to raise the volume again on this issue. The material affects the lives of Black people in our community, in the UK more broadly, and all around the world. The volume has been raised, but it's now time, as Simon mentioned, to get doing, to make it a year of doing and action. We hope that you can take the advice from this conversation and the recommendations from Stephen's incredible report as a blueprint to make action in your community and improve the lives of Black people in your community in the UK more broadly. Good night and thank you.